fundamentalism of the church. And so Emil Kapuya told him that he had no right to be in the church, let alone to preach to the people, if he really did not believe what he was preaching or the apocalyptic stories of the New Testament, like the book of Revelation. So we can advance. So in his book, That the Devil Finds Work, which is one of the texts where Baldwin recounts the time he spent in the church, he talks about what Emil Kapuya said to him and how pivotal it was in James Baldwin's teenage life. You know, and so he writes in the book, even if I was preaching, even if what I was preaching was gospel, I had no right to preach it if I no longer believed it. To stay in the church merely because I was afraid of leaving it was unutterably far beneath me and too despicable a cowardice for Emil, his friend, to support it and any friend of his. So he left the church and went with Emil one Sunday afternoon to a play or to the movies. Movies are very important to James Baldwin. We can advance. Another person who is very influential in Baldwin's life and was essential for Baldwin's embrace of his calling to be, that is to be a writer, a novelist, an essayist, and also a bit of a poet, was Buford Delaney. 1901 to 1979, he was an impoverished artist who lived in Greenwich Village. And Baldwin's friend, Emil Kapuya, introduced Baldwin to Buford Delaney so that Baldwin would, one, see a Black man doing art and being committed to his vocation. And also it was clear to Emil at this time that Baldwin was leaning to the homosexual side of things. And Buford Delaney, who was a gay man, an artist, someone who loved the spiritual, he's also introduced Baldwin to music besides church music. And so Baldwin says that Buford Delaney introduced him to jazz and to the blues, which also influenced James Baldwin's writing style. Baldwin called Buford Delaney his principal witness, and we can advance. And when I read that, I thought to myself that yes, he certainly was Baldwin's principal witness, because he painted portraits of Baldwin, many portraits of Baldwin, such as this one, Dark Rapture. We can advance. This is another portrait of James Baldwin. I think that says 1954. We can advance. Yet another portrait of James Baldwin, 1945. We can advance. 1963. We can advance. 1965. We can advance. And 1967. So they were very close. And Buford Delaney was very important for Baldwin's development as an artist, as a writer. So we can kind of make a correlation between Delaney's art and Baldwin's art, particularly in terms of Delaney's use of light, right? So Baldwin saw his task not unlike the way Buford Delaney saw his, that is to expose the light, to soak in the light, and then to give it back, the light representing reality and representing truth and so forth. Please advance. So Delaney had a art show, somewhere in Europe. And this is what part of what Baldwin wrote in the brochure. Perhaps I am so struck by the light in Buford's painting because he comes from darkness, that is blackness, as I do, as in fact we all do. But the darkness of Buford's beginning in Tennessee many years ago was a black midnight, indeed, opaque and full of sorrow. And I do not know, nor will any of us ever really know, what kind of strength it was that enabled him to make so dogged and splendid a journey. He was impoverished, as I said, and he also suffered, maybe because he's part of his genetic makeup, or maybe because of the difficulties he experienced as a Black gay artist. But toward the end of his life, he succumbed, Buford did, to mental illness, and paranoid schizophrenia was his problem, and he died in an asylum. But he was very important to James Baldwin. We can advance. Now, another very important person for Baldwin, and there were many, I'm just trying to highlight some of the major ones, was the African-American writer Richard Wright, who for a fairly long time in this country was, along with Ralph Ellison, one of the premier Black writers in the United States. In fact, Richard Wright was instrumental in bringing Baldwin to an attention of a fairly reputable publisher. And the deal was that this publisher would publish James Baldwin's novel, which he'd been working on for many, many years. And the novel became the famous Go Tell It on the Mountain. When Baldwin finally submitted the manuscript to the publisher, he didn't accept it because Baldwin basically said that the manuscript was kind of stillborn because he hadn't yet found his voice or freed himself up emotionally to write about his life, to write about his father, to write about his mother through fictional characters, to write about the turning point in his life at 14 years of age, and so forth. So Richard Wright was very important. Richard Wright left the United States, as many Black artists did, and settled in Paris, France. Baldwin followed, not to follow Richard Wright, but he found that if he stayed in the United States, and he was living in Greenwich Village at the time, he wouldn't survive. The racism was much too thick for him. His novel wasn't working. He had been largely responsible for the welfare of his family and his many siblings after his father died, and he just couldn't take it. So he left the United States in 1948, I believe, and went to Paris, France. And he bumped into Richard Wright over there, and he also bumped into Buford Delaney. Josephine Baker was in the United States. Sidney Bechet, was in France. And Sidney Bechet, outstanding jazz musician, was also in France. So there was a sizable African-American community in France. And there Baldwin began to write more, and he didn't feel the weight of being a Black body in white spaces. He didn't feel the weight of that as much in Paris as he did in the United States. So Richard Wright was a mentor to James Baldwin. We can advance. But while in Europe, Baldwin wrote an essay called Everybody's Protest Novel. And in this piece that was published in the late 40s, early 50s, he criticized mercilessly Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, taking issue with her characterization of the African-American man, Tom. One of the things that Baldwin did was to juxtapose Uncle Tom to Richard Wright's protagonist, Bigger Thomas, in Richard Wright's famous novel, Native Son. And although Uncle Tom is kind of benign, very benign, wouldn't hurt a fly kind of guy, Bigger Thomas is a thug, dangerous. He kills a white woman when he panicked, killed her, decapitated her, put her body in the furnace. It was very, sensational. And so Baldwin says that both characters are in fact figments of the writer's imagination, and that neither Uncle Tom nor Bigger Thomas is true to reality. And that what they both do is to show how difficult it is for Americans, Black and white, to deal with African-American people as people. They're either caricatured as gelded creatures, as with Uncle Tom, or they're depicted as monsters, as is Bigger Thomas. So he writes in Everybody's Protest novel, Bigger Thomas is the monster created by the American Republic, the present awful sum of generations of oppression. But to say that he is a monster is to fall into the trap of making him subhuman. And he must therefore be made representative of a way of life which is real and human in precise ratio to the degree to which he seemed to us monstrous and strange. So Baldwin is basically saying that Bigger Thomas is a stereotype. He's a figment of the American imagination. And the only way to deal with this humanity is which is Black humanity generally, is to demonize him, right? And only in that way is he palatable to the American public, whites especially, but even in the case of Richard Wright, Blacks. We can advance. Seems like we're stuck. There we go. And so he writes, and it was this essay, by the way, that really got me into Baldwin, because I had no idea, because I'd grown up learning about him. The Fire Next Time was sitting around the house. And I read a little bit of it, and I also read Go Tell It on the Mountain. But I really wasn't into Baldwin until I read this essay, and was somewhat astounded by his theological references, So he writes, it seems to me that this idea about this Black man who is a monster implicitly carries implicitly a most remarkable confession. That is, that Negro life is in fact as debased and impoverished as our theology claims. So he's basically saying that this caricature of the Black man stems from an American Protestantism that makes of Black folks devils. That's what he's arguing. So, and further, that the use to which Wright puts this idea can only proceed, Richard Wright, can only proceed from the assumption, not entirely unsound, that Americans, because Baldwin was also a social critic, who invade so far as possible all genuine experience, according to him, have therefore no way of accessing the experience of others and no way of establishing themselves in relation to any way of life which is not their own. And implicitly that serves as a kind of apologetic for segregation. So if you segregate people and keep them apart, you never have to get to know them, and therefore you rest content with the caricatures you draw of them. We can advance. So he's in Paris. He was in Paris when he wrote that essay. Oh, by the way, Richard Wright was wounded terribly by what James Baldwin wrote. He felt he had been betrayed, that he had been stabbed in the back, and their friendship was shattered. So So Baldwin is in Paris, and he meets the love of his life. This is a guy from Switzerland. His name was Lucien Habsburger. And I think Baldwin carried the torch for this guy.
Was he a Swiss German?
I don't know whether he was German or French. I don't know.
Because they have the two biggest populations of Switzerland are Germans and French, although they also have the indigenous people who are called Romanche.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so
they speak a language that kind of sounds like Spanish.
Thanks again. So, did you hear that, Lucien? So he was Baldwin's main squeeze, so to speak, but he never committed to Baldwin the way Baldwin wanted him to. Apparently, Lucien was bisexual and got married to a woman, broke Baldwin's heart. They got back together. Then he married another woman and broke Baldwin's heart. So it was like that. We can advance. Finally, he finished his novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. It came out in 1953. And Lucien and an American woman who was living in Paris, Mary Painter, recognized that Baldwin was about to have a nervous breakdown because he couldn't seem to get his mind right to finish this novel. So Lucien took Baldwin to Lucien's father's chalet, I guess somewhere in Switzerland, where Baldwin finally found the presence of mind to complete the novel. And he said that in that alabaster landscape is what he called it. He had his typewriter and I think 2 records by Bessie Smith, the blues singer. And he said it was by listening to Bessie that he was able to unlock the language for the novel, particularly the vernacular, by listening to the timbre and the syntax of Bessie Smith's blues lyrics. And it enabled Baldwin to remember and to write the vernacular in a way that worked. And for some, Go Tell It on the Mountain is Baldwin's most successful and accomplished novel, although he wrote many. We can advance. A lot of what Baldwin writes about is his experience in the church. And he followed that up with a play that has been performed a number of times here in the States and around the world, the Amen Corner. And it's another reflection of how deeply Baldwin was formed in the Black church. And he lifts up in this play and in the novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, what was most important to Baldwin as a writer and as a human being, and that is love for others particularly, which is the only way, according to Baldwin, that one could love him or herself. And so at the end, Sister Margaret, who is a very fundamentalist preacher and is somewhat based on Baldwin's father, recognized when she's lost her husband and her son goes off to play jazz, that her sanctified preaching and evangelical fundamentalism left out the most important thing in life, which is love. And that should take precedent over dogma and a certain self-righteous holiness, We can advance. We can advance. After the Amen Corner, Baldwin wrote another important novel called Giovanni's Room. And it's about an American white man. In fact, none of the characters in this novel are Black. The protagonist, David, is white American who goes to Paris trying to escape the fact that he is more homosexual than bisexual. And he's misled a woman who he wanted to marry, allegedly. But he goes to France, I guess it's Paris, and he meets this Italian Giovanni. And first, the attraction is merely physical. But then David begins to recognize that he cares more for Giovanni than he would like to. But because he can't be honest with himself about who he is and what he likes, and because he is selfish insofar as he thinks more about himself than he thinks about others who may indeed love him, he destroys Giovanni. I mean, you can read the novel in terms of how that happens, but he abandons Giovanni, and Giovanni is killed afterward. And at the end, David is left to consider the emptiness of his life, and he's forced to confront himself truly. He looks in the mirror. Baldwin claims that this is not what it was billed as and what kept it from being published in the United States for a long time. It's not, he claims, a homosexual novel. He said it is a novel about what happens to one when he is afraid to love another, right? And that makes a lot of sense to me, because we can read novels by heterosexual people, and sometimes the erotic descriptions can be somewhat graphic, but no one then says that the novel is a heterosexual novel. It's just called a novel. So, you know, Baldwin is out, he is free in that sense, and he's telling his readership, look, this is a part of life, right? And what's most important is not one's sexual preference, but the quality of one's soul and the depth of one's ability to love. So for many people, it is a very important novel. And I think it's a very lovely novel in this way. I think it's kind of romantic, and I think the prose is often, you know, very nice. We can advance. Then he writes Notes of a Native Son, which is a collection of his essays, and also Nobody Knows My Name. Nobody Knows My Name features some of the essays Baldwin wrote when he went down south to do some investigative reporting about the civil rights movement. And then we began to see that Baldwin is quite an eloquent and perceptive and precise essayist. In fact, one of my English teachers at Morehouse called Baldwin the premier essayist in American letters. And his talent is on display in these two volumes. We can advance. He then wrote Another Country, which was a fairly successful novel. It was on the bestseller list. Baldwin critiques our nation by giving us intimate looks into American characters, and in exploring the interaction, no holds are barred. So there is homosexuality, there is bisexuality, there's heterosexuality, and all of it serves to make the point that Americans are lost because they really don't know how to accept one another and deal with one another regarding what's essential and in life, according to Baldwin. Again, meaning the quality of your soul and you know the depths of your heart in terms of being able to love and accept others. We can advance. Baldwin's involvement in the civil rights movement was strong, and he knew Malcolm X and revered and loved Malcolm X. He knew Dr. King, talked with him, had heard him preach, and was in his corner 100%. And he was also in Malcolm's corner 100%. He was also very good friends with Medgar Evers, who was killed in Mississippi in 1963, shot in the back as he was about to open his front door. Baldwin spent a lot of time with Medgar Evers, and they went out into the country to try to get some of the Black folk to talk about how they had been terrorized by the Ku Klux Klan and other hateful whites in the South. One of his last book projects, for one of Baldwin's last book projects was a text called "Remember This House," and it was to be a discussion of the legacies of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Dr. King, but he died before before he could complete the proposal. We can advance. The book that made Baldwin world famous and established him as a premier writer in the United States is this slim volume, The Fire Next Time, a very, very eloquent text in which Baldwin shares his ideas about the civil rights movement. He tells us a bit about what life was like for him growing up in Harlem. He talks about the reasons that for which he left the church, and he says a lot of very interesting things about God, which I'll get to in a minute. But this was a bestseller, and it made Baldwin a literary sensation. And as I said, cemented his reputation as one of the finest writers America has produced. We can advance. He made the cover of Time magazine because of his popularity. We can advance. I wanted to show you a clip, but for time's sake, so we can have some interaction, I'll skip this, but there's a picture of him, and then we can advance. This is the cover of the book that I wrote on Baldwin in 2014, prohibitively priced, unfortunately. So I didn't bring any copies for sale because it's ridiculous how much they charge for this. But like I said, one summer, I began to read Baldwin and read Everybody's Protest novel and was struck by one of the things he said about Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. He called the novel a theological terror and claimed that Tom represented some of Stowe's Puritan hangups. And so what she did basically, as I said earlier, was to caricature the Black male in order to make him more palatable to her white Protestant understanding. So this is some of the things he had to say about God throughout his oeuvre, throughout his works. We can advance. This is in The Fire Next Time. It's a very famous quote. If the concept of God has any validity or any use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, then it's time that we got rid of him. So Baldwin is basically arguing that God reflects who we are. God reflects our deepest fears, our deepest desires, and sometimes the depth of our love. And when God becomes a means of demonizing the other or assaulting the other or destroying the other, then God is in fact the devil. And that's what he means, that if the concept of God has any validity, it can only free us from the demonization of others. And if we can't do that, then perhaps we should outgrow God or outgrow theology. Very critical argument. Next, we can advance. Then he says, in Nobody Knows My Name, in a speech he gave at Kalamazoo College in 1960, I believe, and this address reflects his growing interest and involvement in the civil rights movement. He says, God is not anybody's toy. To be with God is really to be involved with some enormous, overwhelming desire and joy and power which you cannot control, which controls you. I conceive of God, in fact, as a means of liberation and not a means to control others. And then we can advance. And this is from The Fire Next Time. The glorification of one race and the consequent debasement of another or others always has been and always will be a recipe for murder. We can advance. And now he talks about salvation. It is impossible to claim salvation. This is one of my favorite quotes. It is impossible to claim salvation and also believe that in this life or in any life to come, one is better than another. We can advance. Salvation does not divide, salvation connects, so that one sees oneself in others and others in oneself. It is not the exclusive property of any dogma, creed, or church. We can advance. It keeps the channel open between oneself and however one wishes to name that which is greater than oneself, God. It has absolutely nothing to do with one's fortunes or one's circumstances in one's passage through this world. We can advance. It is a mighty fortress, even in the teeth of ruin or at the gates of death. It protects one from nothing except one thing. One will never curse God or man. And the idea is that if you curse man or woman, your neighbor, you curse God. Yeah, that's what he is saying. And then two more theological quotes. We can advance, thank you. And this is a photographic essay that he did with another one of his friends from DeWitt Clinton High School, Richard Avedon, who is a very well-known photographer. I've always felt, Baldwin writes, that a human being could only be saved by another human being. I am aware that we do not save each other very often, but I'm also aware that we have each other, that we save each other some of the time. We can advance. And all that God can do, and all that I expect him to do, is lend one the courage to continue one's journey and face one's end when it comes like a man, like a human being, like a woman. We can advance. And here's one of the pictures of him. I think he's in Puerto Rico here. And this was taken shortly before he died. He died, as I said, from cancer. It really ravaged his body. I think it started in his esophagus and it spread throughout his body. Baldwin smoked all the time and drank copious amounts of liquor every day. And he used to like to hang out all night, come home, let's say 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, and write until shortly after dawn, sleep into 12:01, and then it would start all over again. So he lived hard, and maybe, who knows, maybe it caught up with him. He was only 63. We can advance. This is a picture from his funeral at the St. John's Cathedral in New York City. And if you look there, you can see Maya Angelou behind the camera, and then Toni Morrison. And they all spoke at his funeral. Toni Morrison said that Baldwin said all that she wanted to say, and that when she began to write, a lot of her words were taken, as it were, from James Baldwin's mouth. So he was hugely influential on some of our great Morrison writers, like Toni Morrison. And Baldwin knew Toni Morrison when she was an editor at, what was it? I don't remember the company, but he said that, he said, I dig Toni and I trust her, which is a very, very fine thing to say. He said it took him a long time to get through Beloved, because he said, this matronly woman has absolutely deadly intentions. When you pick her up to read, she means to upset you. And she does. Yeah, we can advance. And this was Amiri Baraka, who has said some very harsh things about Baldwin during Baldwin's time. But he spoke. And one of the things he said in concluding his fiery tribute is that James Baldwin was God's black revolutionary mouth. We can advance. Another picture of him, and this clip is to I think it's a YouTube clip of Baldwin singing Precious Lord, Take My Hand. And he sang without musical accompaniment. And everyone thought the funeral was over at St. John's, and it was very quiet. And Baldwin, they played the tape recorder and he sang Precious Lord in the old way, like the way I remember my grandmother in Danville, Virginia singing, and the saints in that little black church, Shiloh Baptist, singing. And people were both astonished because he really seemed to be present, and moved, according to David Leeming, who has written one of Baldwin's biographies. And we can advance. And this is a picture of a stamp that was dedicated to Baldwin some years ago. So he's a very, very important American figure. If you haven't had a chance to see the recent documentary on him, I'm Not Your Negro, I highly recommend it. It will give you more insight into Baldwin. So thank you very much for listening, and I can take questions now if you'd like.
We have some time for questions. Thank you. Questions?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you said something about Baldwin's theology. How do you think, what would it have been like if he had remained in the church? If he remained in the church as, say, a pastor, what would it have been like? Do you think that he could have become a well-known black preacher or something like that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, I hesitate to try to answer good questions like that. Because, you know, it's speculation, you know. I think what, for me, the thing to talk about is, you know, why he left the church and why he remained, in many respects, a so-called post-Christian, although he never lost the cadence of his preaching voice, never stopped making references to old songs or spirituals, and, you know, didn't stop writing really about the church in The Fire Next Time, The Devil Finds Work. In some of his novels, I talked about Go Tell It on the Mountain, Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, Over My Head. And a lot of things that he says about the church in those novels, it's very harsh, are very harsh. So I don't think Baldwin had it in him to stay in the church. For one reason, he didn't find many of the accounts in the Bible credible, right? They may have allegorical meaning or mythical meaning, which oftentimes has a lot of poetic significance, but he didn't believe it in his heart. I mean, like a lot of people, he just had this kind of agnostic, atheistic streak. So that's what.
Basically, he was an atheist.
Well, I think he was a very spiritual person. He believed in God, but God for many is not a personal being like the Father or the Trinity. Yes, I think he is.
I'm afraid I probably already know the answer to the question, but are Baldwin's books on the banned book list?
It could be. I don't know. I know Toni Morrison's books have been banned, both Beloved and The Bluest Eye.
And if so, what can we do about it?
Vote, I guess. Yeah, sure.
So I'm aware that during the beginnings of Malcolm X's civil rights career, he was focused a lot more on more leftist extremist ideas.
Malcolm X, you say?
Yeah, for like the creating different narratives around segregating white people and black people.
Mm-hmm.
How did that affect James Baldwin?
Well, Baldwin disagreed with that part of Malcolm's legacy.
Can you repeat your question?
The question that you asked is Malcolm X was kind of, as you said, left wing and was an art segregationist and advocated separation from whites. And also had some very negative things to say, very racist things to say about whites, namely that all whites were devils, and there's a whole mythology that goes along with that. Baldwin disagreed with Malcolm about that. He recognized that a lot of what Malcolm said was true, but Baldwin never believed that the races should be separate. And after Minister Malcolm left the Nation of Islam in 1964 and embraced Orthodox Islam of the Sunni variety, he also began to talk about the brotherhood of humanity and cast aside and never picked up again the racist worldview of the Nation of Islam. And of course, that only brought Malcolm and James Baldwin closer together. In fact, Baldwin wrote a screenplay for a movie about Malcolm X, but claimed that in the name of the screenplay, which is now published as One Day When I Was Lost, but according to James Baldwin, Broadway wanted to take over the script and say things about Malcolm that Baldwin didn't say. But I just say that to point out that he loved Malcolm X and was devastated when Malcolm was assassinated in 1965. And one of the things that he loved about Malcolm X was his ability to change. Yeah, thank you. It's a good question.
So I want to ask the question the opposite. What if you had been raised in a church that emphasized God's love? And, and the major commandment to us is to love one another. Right.
Well, I mean, presumably that's one of the things he heard at church. Because, well, his father may have talked about Jesus as love. I mean, he knew the Bible, but Baldwin claimed that his father was more attracted to the Hebrew Bible deity, the God who slays the Canaanites and so forth, But Baldwin said in The Fire Next Time that the church folk talked about love and tolerance. He talked about his church folk in the little church he went to until they went outside. And all of the love talk was gone. And that's in part why he concluded that there was too much hypocrisy in the church. So, I mean, we do preach love a lot, but we talk the talk. But for Baldwin, it was most important to walk the walk. Yeah, so that's why.
I think that's driven a lot of people out of the church.
I think so.
Well, the young people are going in that direction.
Yes.
I have a question. Yeah, Jim.
You mentioned that he was found with Medgar Evers. What did he do with Medgar Evers? Was his own life in danger the way Medgar Evers was?
He thought so. He thought so when he came back from the South one time. He was so stressed out that he stayed incognito for like 2 weeks, just trying to adjust or to recuperate from the fear he felt and the stress of going into the lion's den. But he went and spent some time with Medgar Evers under the auspices of the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. And so he kind of shadowed Medgar Evers. And I think there had been some violence against the Black community perpetrated by Ku Klux Klan type. So Baldwin said he went out into the dead of night, in the still night, dark night of Mississippi, and they would go to Black people's homes, and lights were out. And he remembers going in to talk to these people to try to get a statement from them, Medgar Evers tried, and you could see the fear of these people, And I guess that's one of the things that let him know that, he was not in hospitable territory. And then Medgar was killed in 1963. And Baldwin was devastated. In part, he dedicated his play that was on Broadway for a while, Blues for Mr. Charlie, which is very militant, to the memory of Medgar Evers and to the 4 girls that were killed in the 16th Avenue Baptist Church in Alabama in 1963. Yeah, so.
Thank you. Was he attracted to Jesus?
Yes.
And Jesus' message of love?
Yes, he was.
That-
Yes, he was. In fact, I don't know whether he ever got around to filling this content out, but he wanted to write something, a play or something, or a short story or something on Jesus, which he wanted to call A Guy Named Joe. So he liked what Jesus taught and had very, very positive things to say about the Jesus of the gospel. Mhm.
Very powerful
Bless.
presentation.
Oh, yeah.
Does the church that he grew up at still exist?
Now, that's a good question. I don't think so. It was, well, he grew up in a number of churches. A storefront church. When he was a young boy, his father took him and his mother to Abyssinian Baptist Church. But I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think so. Abyssinia is still there, but I don't know about the storefront churches.
So a great presentation for Transfiguration Sunday, and please, the worship with the young people, you have a powerful day. So go in peace.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.